On a freezing Christmas Eve, I walked into the courthouse branded a traitor to my own blood. 15 years ago today, my stepmother beat me for opening a gift too early, but this morning, a note appeared on my doorstep with handwriting I thought I would never see again. The writer knows the secret my family has buried for over a decade. If I follow these words, their freedom and reputation will crumble right before my eyes. My name is Neve Larson. I am 33 years old, and as I walk down the center aisle of the Riverton Superior Court, the sound of my stiletto striking the marble floor echoed like the steady rhythmic beat of a war drum. Click, click, click. Every step was a declaration of war, a sharp contrast to the suffocating silence that had fallen over the gallery the moment the heavy oak doors swung open. I kept my chin high, my spine rigid, and my gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to acknowledge the sea of faces turning to watch the spectacle. To the people of Riverton, Maine, I was a curiosity, a scandal, a walking headline. I could hear the whispers trailing behind me like smoke, hushed but venomous. They called me the ungrateful daughter. I could feel the label sticking to my skin, heavy and cloying. To the rows of spectators sitting on the hard wooden benches behind me, I was the spoiled heiress who was biting the hand that fed her. I was the prodigal child returning not to beg for forgiveness, but to burn the castle down. They looked at my tailored black suit, my polished appearance, and the determined set of my jaw, and they saw only arrogance. They did not see the scars. They did not see the trembling child I had been 15 years ago. They saw only a woman daring to stand against the Larson family, the royalty of our coastal real estate empire. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, the wood cool and smooth under my fingertips. To my right sat Naomi Fletcher, the federal prosecutor who had become my only shield in this hurricane. Naomi did not look at the gallery. She was busy arranging her files, her movements precise and lethal. The fact that Naomi was here, representing the United States government, should have terrified everyone in the room. This was no longer a petty civil dispute over a trust fund or a contested will. This was federal. This was serious. Yet, as I glanced across the aisle, I saw that my family still wore their masks of untouchable arrogance. My stepmother, Camilla Larson, sat at the defense table. She looked impeccable, as she always did. She wore a cream-colored suit that probably cost more than most people in this room earned in 3 months. Her blonde hair was coiffed into a perfect, soft wave that framed a face which defied the passage of time. Likely thanks to the best surgeons in Switzerland, she sat with her ankles crossed and her hands folded demurely in her lap, projecting the image of a grieving, confused mother who could not understand why her stepdaughter was doing this. She offered a polite, tight-lipped smile to a reporter in the second row. But when her eyes flickered over to me, the mask slipped for a fraction of a second. Her eyes were cold. They were the same eyes that had watched me scream on a Christmas Eve 15 years ago. They were sharp, calculating, and devoid of any human warmth. In that brief exchange of glances, Camilla was telling me what she had told me 1,000 times before without saying a word. She was telling me that I was nothing. She was telling me that I would lose, just as I had always lost. But she was wrong. Today was different. Next to her sat my father, Richard Larson. He was a man over 60, yet he commanded the space around him with the vitality of someone much younger. He wore his custom navy suit like armor. His silver hair swept back, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. He did not look at me with hate, which somehow made it worse. He looked at me with profound disappointment and a simmering anger, as if I were an unruly employee who had failed to meet a quota rather than his own flesh and blood. To Richard Larson, family was a business, and I was bad for business. He looked at me as if I had personally taken a sledgehammer to the foundation of harborline communities, the empire he had built on the rocky coast of Maine. He was used to being the judge, jury, and executioner in his own world. Seeing me on the opposite side of a legal divide, backed by the power of the federal government, was an insult he could not comprehend. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick enough to choke on. The air smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the nervous sweat of the wealthy who feared exposure. The gallery was packed. I recognized faces from the country club, from the charity galas, and from the boardrooms of rival development firms. The press was jammed into the back 2 rows, their pens poised, their recorders running. They were all waiting for the slaughter. They were waiting to see the Larson family attorneys, a team of sharks in expensive suits, tear me apart. They wanted to see the girl who opened her Christmas gift too early get punished one last time. I took a slow breath, letting the oxygen fill my lungs, steadying my heart rate. For years, I had let them control the narrative. I had let them paint me as the unstable, greedy child who could not follow simple rules. I had let them convince the world that the discipline I received was necessary, that I was the problem. But as I sat there, feeling the weight of the courtroom pressing down on me, I realized something that made a small, cold smile tug at the corner of my mouth. The power dynamic had shifted. They just did not know it yet. For the first time in my life, I was not the one under the microscope. They were. I looked down at the table in front of me. Naomi had organized our evidence into neat, color-coded stacks, but my eyes were drawn to a single folder that sat slightly apart from the rest. It was thin, unassuming, and terrified me more than anything else in the room. Inside that folder lay a single sheet of paper. It was not a legal affidavit. It was not a bank statement or a contract. It was a handwritten note, scrawled on stationery that had yellowed with age. I reached out and placed my hand on the folder. I could almost feel the heat radiating from it. That piece of paper was the reason we were all here. It was the reason the Federal Bureau of Investigation had opened a file on Harborline communities. It was the reason my father's hands were clenched into fists on top of his mahogany table. It had started on Christmas morning, just a few days ago. The memory was so vivid it superimposed itself over the courtroom. I remembered the biting cold of the wind coming off the bay, the silence of my apartment, and the innocuous way the note had been lying on my doormat. It had looked like trash. It had looked like nothing. But when I read the words, the world had tilted on its axis. The handwriting on that note belonged to a ghost. It belonged to someone who had been dead for nearly 2 decades, and the message it carried was a key that unlocked a door my family had cemented shut 15 years ago. I ran my thumb along the edge of the folder. The irony was suffocating. 15 years ago, on a night that was supposed to be filled with joy and celebration, I had been beaten for opening a gift. I had been struck, humiliated, and cast aside because I dared to seek a connection with my late mother. Camilla had called it discipline. My father had called it a lesson. They had told everyone I was a thief, a sneak, a child with no respect for tradition. They had used that night to justify sending me away, to justify cutting me out, to justify erasing me. But they had missed something, in their arrogance, in their haste to cover up their cruelty. They had missed the loose thread. They thought that by destroying the box and ripping up the papers inside it that night, they had destroyed the evidence. They thought that fear would keep me silent forever. They were wrong. The note in this folder proved that the past was not dead. It was not even past. It was alive, and it was dangerous. The person who wrote the note knew the secret. They knew what was really inside that gift box 15 years ago. They knew about the safe. They knew about the money. And most importantly, they knew about the betrayal. I looked up again, my eyes locking with Camilla's. She was whispering something to her lead attorney, a man named Mark Duval, who was nodding with feigned confidence. Camilla adjusted the diamond brooch on her lapel, the light catching the stone and sending a fractured rainbow across her chest. She looked secure. She looked like a woman who believed she was untouchable because she had money, influence, and the right last name. She thought this was just another nuisance lawsuit she could settle with a check and a non-disclosure agreement. She did not know about the note. She did not know that I had followed the instructions. She did not know that I had found the loose brick. She did not know that the federal prosecutor sitting next to me wasn't just looking for tax evasion or fraud. She was looking for a conspiracy that went back to the days before my mother died. I watched my father lean in to listen to Camilla. He looked tired. The stress of the last few days was etching deeper lines around his mouth. I felt a pang of something that might have been pity, but I crushed it instantly. He had made his choice. On that Christmas Eve, 15 years ago, when he stood in the doorway and watched his wife strike his daughter, he had made his choice. He had chosen the lie. He had chosen the money. He had chosen the path of least resistance. Now, he would have to walk that path to its end. Naomi leaned toward me, her voice low and steady. She asked me if I was ready. I nodded. I was more than ready. I had been ready for 15 years. I looked at the judge, a stern woman with gray hair and glasses who was currently reviewing the docket. I looked at the court reporter, whose fingers were hovering over the stenotype machine. I looked at the bailiff standing by the door. Everything in this room felt hyper-real. The buzzing of the fluorescent lights overhead sounded like a hive of angry bees. The scratch of a pen on paper 2 rows back sounded like a knife being sharpened. My senses were dialed up to 100%. I was vibrating with adrenaline, but on the outside, I remained a statue of ice. I thought about the note again. I thought about the 3 sentences that had brought me here. The writer had warned me. They had told me that if I dared to follow the trail, everything would collapse. Not just the reputation of the Larson family, but their freedom. They would go to prison. The great Richard Larson and his socialite wife would trade their oceanfront view for concrete walls. And for what? For greed, for control, for fear. I took a sip of water from the glass on the table. The water was lukewarm, but it helped soothe the dryness in my throat. I needed to be clear. I needed to be articulate. When I took the stand, I could not be the emotional, broken girl they wanted me to be. I had to be the witness. I had to be the evidence. The judge banged her gavel, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. The murmuring in the gallery died instantly. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with anticipation. "All rise," the bailiff bellowed. We stood. The rustle of clothing was the only sound. I felt Naomi's presence beside me, a pillar of strength. I felt the eyes of the room boring into my back, but I kept my eyes on the front. The session was beginning. The opening statements were about to start. Mark Duval would paint a picture of a loving family besieged by a mentally unstable daughter. He would talk about generosity and betrayal. He would use words like tragedy and regret. Then, Naomi would stand up. She would not use flowery language. She would use facts. She would talk about trust funds and shell companies. She would talk about fiduciary duty and criminal negligence. And eventually, she would introduce Exhibit A, the note. I touched the folder one last time, grounding myself. I was Nevaeh Larson. I was the girl who survived the cold. I was the girl who survived the silence. And today, in this courtroom, surrounded by the people who had tried to erase me, I was finally going to tell the truth. The truth about the gift. The truth about the slap. The truth about the theft. I looked at Camilla one last time as we sat back down. She was still smiling that perfect, plastic smile, but I saw the tremor in her hand as she reached for her water. She knew something was wrong. She could feel the storm coming, even if she refused to look at the clouds. Let them smile, I thought. Let them think they are safe for 5 more minutes, because once that folder is opened, once the words on that yellowed paper are read into the record, the world they built on lies will shatter into 1,000,000 pieces. I am ready. Let the trial begin. The courtroom sounds faded into a dull hum, replaced by the phantom ringing of crystal glasses and the heavy, suffocating scent of pine and expensive perfume. My mind drifted back 15 years, pulling me relentlessly toward the memory I had spent over a decade trying to outrun. It was the night the illusion of my family finally shattered, the night I learned that blood means nothing when money is on the line. I was 18 years old that Christmas. Legally, I was an adult. I could vote, I could sign contracts, and I could leave. But inside the sprawling Larson estate on North Bay, I was still treated like a wayward child, a prop to be moved around to suit the aesthetic of my father's new life. The mansion was a beast of a house, perched on the edge of the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic, and on that night, it was ablaze with light. Every window glowed gold against the dark. Freezing ocean. Inside, the air was hot and loud. My father and Camilla were hosting their annual Christmas Eve gala. The guest list was a who's who of the state's elite. Politicians, investors, rivals my father was trying to acquire, and friends Camilla was trying to impress. I moved through the crowd like a ghost in a silk dress, smiling when spoken to, fading into the background when ignored. I felt like an imposter in my own home. These people did not know me. They knew Richard Larson's daughter, the quiet girl who had survived the tragedy of her mother's death, but they did not know Nevaeh. The centerpiece of the great hall was a Christmas tree that touched the vaulted ceiling. It was a masterpiece of professional decoration, draped in velvet ribbons and shimmering glass ornaments that probably cost more than a mid-sized car. Underneath it lay a mountain of gifts, wrapped in gold and silver paper. Looking like a dragon's hoard, I had no interest in them. I knew what they were: expensive tokens of obligation, a cashmere scarf from an aunt I never saw, a leather planner from my father's assistant. Things that said, "I acknowledge your existence, but I do not know who you are." But then I saw it. I had been kneeling to adjust the skirt of the tree, trying to hide from a drunken business associate of my father who kept asking about my college plans. When I spotted a small box tucked deep near the trunk, it was wrapped in simple blue paper, starkly different from the professional gold and silver themes Camilla had mandated. A silver ribbon was tied clumsily around it. I reached for it, my heart doing a strange flutter in my chest. I pulled it into the light. There was a tag attached. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was loopy, elegant, and instantly brought tears to my eyes. For Nevaeh, open only on Christmas morning. And below that, a single signature: Mom. The room seemed to tilt. My mother, Julia, had been dead for 6 years. How could this be here? Had she hidden it before she died? Had someone kept it for me? The logical part of my brain tried to find an explanation. Perhaps an old gift found in storage. But the emotional part of me, the part that was still a grieving 12-year-old girl, did not care. It was a message from her. It was a lifeline thrown across the void of death. I clutched the box to my chest, suddenly terrified that Camilla would see it. If she saw it, she would take it. She would call it clutter. She would say it disrupted her aesthetic. Or worse, she would laugh at me for clinging to the past. I needed to be alone. I needed to hear my mother's voice, even if it was just through an object. I checked the grandfather clock in the hall. It was 20 minutes to midnight. Technically, it was not Christmas morning yet, but I could not wait. I physically could not endure another 12 hours of wondering. I slipped away from the party, moving through the servants' corridors to avoid the guests. I made my way to my father's study on the second floor. It was the only room I knew would be empty. The door was heavy oak, and it creaked softly as I pushed it open. The room smelled of old leather, cigar smoke, and the expensive scotch my father drank when he was stressed. A fire was dying in the grate, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls lined with books that no one ever read. I sat on the Persian rug near the fire, my hands trembling so violently I could barely undo the ribbon. I felt like a thief. I was stealing a moment with my own mother. The paper fell away. I opened the lid. There was no jewelry inside. There was no locket or heirloom. Inside, resting on a bed of cotton, was a single, tarnished brass key. It looked old, the kind of key that opened a door no one had walked through in decades. Beneath the key was a folded piece of paper. I unfolded the note. The paper was yellowed, smelling faintly of the lavender perfume my mother used to wear. The handwriting was hers, but it was hurried, jagged, as if she had written it in a panic. My darling Nevaeh. If you are reading this, then I was not able to tell you myself. There is a secret safe under the old fireplace. Count the third brick from the left. Do not let them know. It is yours. Mom. I stared at the words, confusion warring with the grief. The old fireplace? She must have meant the house on Alder Street, the modest brick home we lived in before my father's business exploded, before we moved to this palace on the cliffs. But why? What was in a safe? And why the secrecy? Do not let them know. Them. My thumb brushed the brass key. It felt cold and heavy. "What do you think you are doing?" The voice sliced through the silence like a whip. I jumped, dropping the note. Camilla stood in the doorway. She was silhouetted by the light from the hallway, her evening gown shimmering like liquid steel. She did not look like a mother concerned for a child found alone in the dark. She looked like a predator who had found a rat in her pantry. I scrambled to pick up the note, but my fingers were clumsy. I found a gift," I stammered, my voice sounding small and pathetic. "From Mom." Camilla stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. The click of the latch sounded like a prison cell locking. She walked toward me, her heels sinking into the thick rug. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "A gift?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "From a dead woman? Do not be ridiculous. Neva, give that to me." "No," I said, clutching the box and the key. "It has my name on it." "It is past midnight," she lied, though we both knew it was not. "You are sneaking around. You are stealing." "I am not stealing." I stood up, trying to muster the dignity of my 18 years. "It is mine. It was under the tree." Camilla lunged. She did not ask. She did not negotiate. She moved with a speed that shocked me. Her manicured hand lashed out and struck me across the face. The sound was a sharp crack, loud in the quiet room. My head snapped to the side. The sting was immediate, hot and burning, blooming across my cheek like a brand. I was so stunned I dropped the box. The brass key clattered onto the hardwood floor. Camilla did not look at me. She looked at the floor. She swooped down and snatched up the note and the key before I could recover. "You ungrateful little brat," she hissed, reading the note. Her eyes scanned the lines, and for a second, I saw something in her face that terrified me more than the slap. I saw fear, genuine, panic-induced fear. "Give it back," I cried, tears springing to my eyes, not from the pain, but from the violation. "That is from my mother." "Your mother is dead," Camilla screamed, her voice losing its composed veneer. "She is dead, and you are here, ruining everything. You open gifts early. You sneak around in your father's office. Is this how we raised you? To be a greedy, impatient sneak?" She was rewriting reality in real time. She was turning my grief into a character flaw. She was making me the villain for wanting to read a letter from my mother. The door opened again. My father stood there. Richard Larson, the man who was supposed to protect me. He looked at me, holding my cheek, tears streaming down my face. Then he looked at Camilla, who was clutching the note and the key as if they were weapons she had disarmed from an attacker. "Richard," Camilla said, her voice dropping instantly to a wounded, shaky register. She was going through your things. She found this. It is just some old nonsense Julia left behind to confuse her." My father walked into the room. He did not come to me. He did not check my face. He looked at the key in Camilla's hand. He recognized it. I saw the color drain from his face. "Daddy," I choked out. "She hit me. It was a gift for me. Mom left it." My father looked at me then. His eyes were hard, devoid of any warmth. He looked at me as if I were a stranger who had caused a scene at a restaurant. "You should not be in here, Nevaeh," he said coldly, "and you should not be opening things that do not belong to you." "But it had my name on it," I pleaded. "It is not for you," he said, his voice final. "That box, it contains things that are complicated, things that will only cause trouble for this family. For me—" "Trouble?" I whispered. "It is just a key." "It is defiance," Camilla interjected, stepping closer to Richard, aligning herself with him against me. "She is out of control. Richard, sneaking, lying, stealing. She has no respect for us. No respect for the life you provide." My father nodded slowly. "Camilla is right. You have shown a complete lack of judgment tonight. Nevaeh, opening gifts early, like a spoiled child?" The injustice of it felt like a physical weight crushing my chest. They were making it about the timing. They were making it about etiquette. But I knew, even then, that it was about the key. Camilla looked at the note in her hand. "This is garbage," she said. "Just sentimental poison meant to turn her against us." And then, right in front of me, she began to tear the paper. "No!" I screamed, lunging forward. My father caught my arm, his grip bruising. He held me back as Camilla ripped the yellowed paper into halves, then quarters, then confetti. "Stop it!" I sobbed, struggling against him. "Please, stop!" But she didn't stop. She tore it until my mother's handwriting was nothing but scraps. She walked over to the dying fire and tossed the pieces onto the embers. I watched, helpless, as the paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash. The words of my mother, her last message to me, vanished in a puff of gray smoke. But Camilla had made a mistake. Just before she tore the last piece, the firelight had flared up, illuminating the bottom of the page. I had seen one last sentence, written in faint pencil, almost invisible. "Assets prepared to protect you from this house." It burned. Camilla turned back to me, the brass key now safely tucked into the pocket of her gown. She looked triumphant. "I will keep this key," she said smoothly, "for safekeeping, until you are mature enough to handle whatever rusty old trinkets your mother hoarded, which clearly is not tonight." My father released my arm. He looked tired. He looked at me with disgust. "Go to your room. Neve. Stay there until the guests leave. I do not want to see you." "But Daddy—" "Go!" he shouted, the mask of the calm patriarch slipping. "Get out of my sight." I turned and ran. I ran out of the study, down the back stairs, and through the kitchen. I burst out the side door into the freezing night air. I did not go to my room. I could not breathe in that house. I collapsed onto the stone bench on the patio, the cold granite biting through my thin silk dress. The snow had started to fall again. Large, wet flakes landed on my bare arms and melted against my hot skin. My cheek throbbed where she had slapped me. The physical pain was a dull ache, but the internal pain was sharp and agonizing. I sat there in the dark, shivering violently. Inside, the party continued. I could hear the muffled sound of a jazz band playing Silent Night. I could hear bursts of laughter. They were warm. They were drinking champagne. They were celebrating family and legacy. And I was out here in the cold. I looked at the dark ocean churning below the cliffs. They had taken the note. They had burned the words. They had taken the key. They thought they had won. They thought they had put the child back in her place. But as I sat there, watching the snow cover my expensive shoes, something inside me hardened. The tears stopped. The sobbing ceased. I replayed the line I had seen before the fire took it. "Assets prepared to protect you from this house." My mother knew. She knew this house was dangerous. She knew these people were dangerous. She had left me a shield, and they had stolen it. I touched my cheek. It was cold now. "I will not forget this," I whispered to the wind. "I will never forget this." I did not know how, and I did not know when, but I swore that one day I would find out what was under that fireplace. I would find out what they were so afraid of, and I would make them pay for every tear, every lie, and every second I spent shivering in the snow while they toasted to their own greatness. That Christmas, the girl who just wanted a mother died, and in the freezing cold, something else was born, something patient, something cold, something that would wait 15 years for a note to appear on a doormat. The silence of my apartment on Christmas morning was something I had carefully curated. For the last 10 years, ever since I scraped together enough money to move out of the Larson shadow, I had spent this holiday alone. My loft in the warehouse district of Riverton was the antithesis of the North Bay mansion. It was industrial, with exposed brick walls, high metal beams, and large windows that looked out over the gray, churning waters of the commercial harbor. There were no 12-foot trees here. There were no mountains of gold-wrapped gifts that meant nothing. There was just me, a cup of strong black coffee, and the peace of knowing that no one was going to scream at me today. I stood by the window, wrapping my oversized wool cardigan tighter around myself. The city below was still sleeping, A light snow was falling, dusting the rooftops of the old factories and warehouses with a layer of pristine white. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way. I preferred this gritty reality to the polished, fake warmth of my father's house. Here, the cold was just weather. There, the cold was in the blood. The digital clock on my microwave blinked. It was 8 in the morning. I had a routine. I would drink my coffee. I would open the door to retrieve the copy of the Riverton Gazette that I still insisted on having delivered, and then I would spend the day reading and ignoring my phone. I walked to the heavy steel door of my apartment. I unlocked the deadbolt. The sound a satisfying, heavy thud. When I pulled the door open, the hallway was empty and quiet. The air smelled faintly of someone's burnt toast. I looked down, expecting to see the rolled-up newspaper. It was not there. Instead, lying perfectly centered on my welcome mat, was a piece of paper. It was not an envelope. It was just a single sheet of white paper. Folded once in half, it looked stark against the dark bristles of the mat. I frowned. My building had a secure entry system. You needed a fob to get into the lobby and another fob to operate the elevator. Delivery people usually left packages in the secure room downstairs. They did not come up to the penthouse floor. I stepped out into the hallway, looking left and right. The long corridor was empty. The motion sensor lights were all on, casting a sterile yellow glow on the concrete floor. There was no sound of footsteps, no closing doors, just silence. I bent down and picked up the paper. It felt heavy, high-quality stock, the kind used for formal stationery, but it had no letterhead. I stepped back inside and locked the door immediately, a prickle of unease running down my spine. I walked to the kitchen island and set the paper down next to my coffee mug. I stared at it for a moment, my heart beating a little faster than it should have. It was just a piece of paper, I told myself, probably a neighbor leaving a note about noise or a package mix-up. I unfolded it. The breath left my lungs in a sharp, painful rush. The world seemed to narrow down to the words written in the center of the page. The old fireplace remains. Behind the third brick on the left is the answer. Do not let them erase everything. J. I gripped the edge of the granite counter so hard my knuckles turned white. I knew that handwriting. I knew the specific way the letters slanted to the right, the elegant loops of the L and the H. I knew the precise, almost architectural structure of the capital letters. It was my mother's handwriting. But that was impossible. Julia Larson had been dead for over 2 decades. I had watched her casket be lowered into the ground. I had visited her grave every year on her birthday. Dead women did not write notes. Dead women did not slip pieces of paper under the doors of high-security apartments on Christmas morning. My eyes fixated on the signature, J. Just one letter, but it was the letter she used to sign the notes she put in my lunchbox when I was 7. It was the letter she used on the birthday cards she made by hand. I read the message again, my mind racing, trying to find a logical explanation. The old fireplace remains. The words triggered a memory so sharp it felt like a physical blow. The note from 15 years ago, the one Camilla had burned in the grate. That note had mentioned a fireplace too. It had mentioned a safe. I remembered the charred fragment I had seen before the flames consumed it. Assets prepared to protect you. This new note was finishing the sentence that Camilla had destroyed. Behind the third brick on the left, a chill that had nothing to do with the winter draft swept through the apartment. Someone knew. Someone knew exactly what had happened in my father's study 15 years ago. Only 3 people had been in that room. Me, Camilla, and Richard. And I knew for a fact that neither my father nor my stepmother would ever send me a roadmap to the secrets they had fought so hard to bury. So who wrote this? Was it a forgery? Was someone playing a sick, twisted game with my trauma? But the handwriting was perfect. I ran my finger over the ink. It was black ink, written with a fountain pen. It looked fresh. It did not look like a photocopy of an old letter. Someone had written this recently. A sudden wave of paranoia crashed over me. I spun around, scanning my apartment. The open-plan space suddenly felt full of hiding spots. Was someone watching me right now? I grabbed my laptop from the coffee table and flipped it open. I logged into the building's resident portal. As the owner of the penthouse unit, I had access to the camera feed for my specific hallway. I needed to see who had dropped this off. I needed to see a face. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I pulled up the archive for the camera labeled Floor 5, East Corridor. I scrolled back on the timeline. I had woken up at 7. I found the note at 8. The person must have come within that hour. I watched the timestamp tick backward. 7:55, 7:50, 7:45. The hallway remained empty on the screen. Nothing but the gray concrete floor and the closed doors of my neighbors. I kept scrolling back. 7:30, 7:15. Then the screen flickered. At exactly 7:12 in the morning, the video feed cut to black. The timestamp kept running, counting the seconds, but the image was gone. It remained black for exactly 3 minutes. At 7:15, the image returned, and there, on my doormat, in the pixelated footage, was the white square of the folded paper. I stared at the screen, my blood running cold. It was not a malfunction. Cameras do not just malfunction for exactly 3 minutes right when a mysterious intruder is at your door. This was a loop, or a cut. Someone had hacked the system. Someone with skill, someone with resources, had disabled the surveillance just long enough to deliver the message and disappear. I slammed the laptop shut. This was not a prank. A prankster does not have the ability to scrub security footage. This was professional. I looked back at the note. Do not let them erase everything. The fear began to morph into something else, something sharper. For 15 years. I had carried the shame of that Christmas night. I had believed, on some level, the narrative my family had spun, that I was the unruly child, the one who broke the rules, the one who provoked Camilla's violence. I had internalized the idea that the slap was a punishment for my behavior. But looking at this note, a different truth began to assemble itself in my mind. Camilla had not slapped me because I was rude. She had not burned that note because she hated clutter. She had reacted with such immediate visceral violence because she was terrified. She had been terrified of what was in that box. It was not about discipline, it was about containment. They were hiding something massive, something that required burning evidence in a fireplace and, 15 years later, required scrubbing security footage to warn me about. The old fireplace remains. I knew exactly which fireplace the note meant. It was not the marble monstrosity in the North Bay mansion. It was the humble, red brick fireplace in the house on Alder Street, the house where I was born, the house where my mother and I had lived before my father's business finally struck gold and he moved us to the coast. That house had been part of my life for the first 10 years. It was where my mother had been happy. After she died, and after we moved, I assumed my father had sold it, but a few years ago, when I was digging through public records for a work project, I had noticed something odd. The deed to the Alder Street property was still held by a shell company, Red Brick LLC, which was a subsidiary of Harborline Communities. They had kept the house. They had never sold it, never rented it out. It had been sitting there, empty and rotting, for nearly 20 years. Why? Why would Richard Larson, a man who monetized every square inch of dirt he touched, hold on to a decaying property in a working-class neighborhood? Because it was a vault. I looked at the clock. It was now 8:30 in the morning. If I went there, I would be walking into a trap. I knew that. The missing security footage proved that I was being watched. Whoever left this note knew where I lived. They knew my schedule. And if they knew that, the people they were warning me against, my family, might know too. Going to Alder Street on Christmas Day was insane. It was dangerous. I should call the police. I should call a lawyer. But what would I say? That a ghost left me a note? That I was going to break into a house my father owned to look for a loose brick? The police would laugh. Or worse, they would call Richard Larson, and he would have me committed for a psychiatric evaluation, something he had threatened to do more than once. No, I had to do this myself. I looked at the signature again, J. If there was even a 1% chance that this was real, that my mother had left something for me, something that had survived the fire and the lies and the years of silence, I had to find it. She had tried to reach me 15 years ago, and they had stopped her. I would not let them stop her again. I stood up. I went to my bedroom and changed out of my pajamas. I put on dark jeans, heavy boots, and a thick turtleneck sweater. I grabbed my long black coat. I did not take my usual purse. Instead, I took a small backpack. I threw in a flashlight, a flathead screwdriver from my toolkit, and a pair of leather gloves. I walked back to the kitchen. I picked up the note. I did not want to leave it here. If they could get in to leave it, they could get in to take it back. I folded it carefully and zipped it into the inside pocket of my coat, right against my heart. I grabbed my car keys. The drive to Alder Street would take 20 minutes. The roads would be empty. The city would be distracted by gifts and family dinners. It was the perfect time to commit a felony. I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. I could just stay here. I could throw the note in the trash, drink my coffee, and watch old movies. I could continue to be safe. I could continue to be the Nevaeh who survived by staying invisible. But I looked at the empty space on the floor where the note had been. Don't let them erase everything. I was done being erased. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway. The air was still and silent, but now it felt charged with electricity. I walked to the elevator, my boots making no sound on the carpet. I hit the button for the garage. I was going home, not to the mansion on the cliffs, but to the real home, the one with the red bricks and the secrets in the walls. And if there was a loose brick, I was going to find it, even if I had to tear the whole house down with my bare hands. I pulled my car onto the cracked pavement of Alder Street, the engine idling with a low rumble that seemed too loud in the quiet. Gray afternoon. This neighborhood had not gentrified like the rest of Riverton. It remained frozen in a kind of working-class stasis, the houses modest and tightly packed, their lawns brown and dormant under the thin layer of fresh snow. House number 42 stood at the end of the block. It was a red brick structure, sturdy and unpretentious, but it looked like a corpse compared to the homes around it. While the neighbors had wreaths on their doors and twinkling lights in their windows, my childhood home was dark. A metal sign staked in the frozen front yard read, "Harborline Asset Management, Private Property, No Trespassing." I killed the engine. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers ached. I had not set foot on this property in 20 years, not since the day my father packed us up and moved us to the coast, leaving behind the memories of my mother as if they were just old furniture he could not be bothered to move. I grabbed my backpack and stepped out of the car. The wind bit at my face, sharp and smelling of wood smoke from someone else's chimney. I walked up the driveway, my boots crunching on the gravel. I did not go to the front door. I knew from memory that the lock on the back porch door had always been temperamental. If the house had been sitting empty for 2 decades, the wood had likely rotted enough to give me an opening. I circled to the back. The yard was a tangle of dead vines and overgrown bushes. I climbed the 3 wooden steps to the back porch. The screen door was hanging off one hinge, swinging slightly in the wind with a rhythmic, mournful creak. I tried the inner door. Locked. I pulled the flathead screwdriver from my bag. I jammed it into the gap between the door and the frame, right by the lock. The wood was soft with age. I leaned my weight into it, gritting my teeth, with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. The wood splintered, and the door popped open. I slipped inside and closed the door behind me, engaging the deadbolt to keep it shut, though I doubted it would stop anyone determined. The smell hit me first. It was the smell of time, dust, stale air, and beneath it all, the faint, ghostly scent of lavender and floor wax. It smelled like my mother. I clicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a kitchen that looked like a stage set after the actors had gone home. The appliances were gone, leaving dark, gaping holes in the cabinetry. I moved into the living room. It was a graveyard of furniture. The sofas and chairs were covered in white dust sheets, looking like shapeless phantoms huddled together in the dark. The air was freezing, colder inside than it was out. My breath plumed in front of me as I walked toward the far wall. And there it was, the fireplace. It was made of rough-hewn river stone, Not the polished marble of the North Bay mansion. It looked massive in the dim light, a silent sentinel that had been guarding its secret while the world changed around it. The grate was empty, cold, and clean, swept of ash long ago. I approached it slowly. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that made my hands shake. The old fireplace remains. I knelt on the hearth. The stone was like ice against my jeans. I shone the flashlight on the left side of the fireplace surround. Behind the third brick on the left. I counted up from the hearth. 1, 2, 3. It looked just like the others, a gray, jagged stone held in place by crumbling mortar. I touched it. It felt solid. Doubt began to creep in. What if this was insane? What if the note was just a cruel prank? I took the screwdriver and dug the tip into the mortar surrounding the third stone. The gray cement crumbled instantly into powder. It was not mortar. It was some kind of dried putty, colored to look like stone. My pulse spiked. I worked the screwdriver around the edge of the stone, scraping away the fake seal. Once I had cleared the perimeter, I wedged the tool into the gap and leveraged it. The stone moved. It slid forward with a heavy, grinding sound. I dropped the screwdriver and used both hands to pull the heavy stone block free from the wall. A cloud of ancient dust puffed out, making me cough. I set the stone down on the hearth and shone the light into the dark cavity behind it. There was a small, hollow space, no bigger than a shoebox, carved directly into the brickwork of the chimney. And inside, sitting in the dust, was a thick envelope wrapped in layers of heavy-duty plastic. I reached in. My fingers brushed the plastic, and I felt a jolt of electricity run up my arm. I pulled it out. It was heavy. I sat back on my heels. Placing the package on the floor in front of me, I used a small pocket knife to slice through the tape and plastic. Inside was a manila envelope, sealed with red wax that had cracked with age. The front of the envelope was blank. I broke the seal and dumped the contents onto the floor. 3 documents slid out. The first was a legal agreement, the paper thick and formal. I picked it up, angling the flashlight to read the text. It was a deed of trust and an investment agreement. The header read, Juniper Trust Holdings. I frowned. I had grown up listening to my father talk business. I knew the names of every subsidiary, every partner, every shell company in the Harborline portfolio. I had never heard of Juniper Trust Holdings. I scanned the document. It detailed a massive transfer of assets, stocks, bonds, and land deeds from something called the Julia V. Larson Revocable Trust into Juniper Trust Holdings. The beneficiaries of Juniper Trust were listed clearly. Nevaeh Larson, 100%. The date on the document was August 15th, 2001. I felt sick. August 15th, my mother died in a car accident on September 10th. This was signed less than 4 weeks before she died. I picked up the second item. It was a letter, handwritten. I recognized the paper immediately. It was the same stationery as the note left on my doormat this morning, the same ink. My dearest Nevaeh, if you are reading this, then my worst fears have come to pass, and I am no longer there to protect you. I need you to listen to me carefully. The world your father and I built is not what it seems. There is darkness in Richard that I ignored for too long because I loved him, and because I loved the life he gave us. But things have changed. He is making moves to merge our assets in ways that will erase my name, and by extension, your future. I have created Juniper Trust Holdings to be your shield. It contains the core assets that my family, your grandparents, left to me. These do not belong to Richard. They belong to you. I have hidden the existence of this company from him, but I fear he suspects something. If I am gone, and if you find that you have nothing, no money, no voice, no power, know that it was stolen. The shares in Juniper are yours. Any document claiming I transferred them to Richard or Harborline is a forgery. Do not let them sign your name. Do not let them tell you I wanted this. I love you more than life itself. Mom. Tears blurred my vision, hot and stinging. I wiped them away furiously. I could not afford to cry, not now. She knew she was in danger. The accident, the slick road, the failed brakes that the police report mentioned but never fully investigated, suddenly took on a sinister, terrifying clarity. She had not just died, she had been removed. I reached for the third document. It was a photocopy, grainy and slightly faded, but legible. It was a last will and testament, but it was not the one that had been read after the funeral. That will had been simple, everything to Richard, with a small trust for me to be accessed when I turned 25, a trust that Richard had miraculously drained through management fees before I ever saw a dime. This will was different. Item 4. I hereby bequeath 45% of the voting stock in Harborline Communities to my daughter, Neve Larson, effective immediately upon my death. I gasped, the sound echoing in the empty room. 45%. Harborline was a private company. My father owned 51%, or so he claimed. But if my mother owned 45%, and she left it to me? Camilla owned nothing. Richard's control was absolute only because he had absorbed my mother's share. If this will was valid, if this document proved that my mother never intended for her shares to go to Richard, then for the last 15 years, Richard Larson had been voting with stolen stock. Every deal he made, every building he erected, every dollar he pocketed, it was all based on fraud. And not just civil fraud. This was grand larceny. This was criminal. I looked at the signature on the will. It was witnessed by two people I did not know, but the date matched the trust agreement. August 15th. They had buried this. When Camilla slapped me that Christmas Eve, when she burned the note, she was not just being a cruel stepmother, she was destroying the map to the smoking gun. She knew that if I found the assets prepared to protect me, I would find this. I would find out that I was not just the daughter, I was the major shareholder. I shoved the documents back into the plastic wrapper. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely close the bag. I needed to get out of here. I needed to get this to Naomi. This was not just evidence, it was a nuclear bomb. I stood up, my knees cracking. I shoved the package into my backpack and zipped it tight. I swung the bag onto my shoulder and turned to leave. The house felt different now. It was no longer empty. It felt like the walls were watching me, like the ghosts of the past were screaming for justice. I hurried through the living room, the beam of my flashlight cutting a frantic path through the dust. I reached the kitchen and headed for the back door. I needed to get to my car. I needed to lock the doors and drive until I was safe. I pushed the broken door open and stepped out onto the porch. The wind had picked up, howling through the bare branches of the oak trees. I wondered if you would ever come back. The voice was thin and reedy, coming from the shadows to my left. I spun around, blinding the speaker with my flashlight. Easy, child. Put that light down. You are blinding an old woman. I lowered the beam. Standing on the other side of the low wooden fence that separated the yards was a figure bundled in a heavy wool coat and a knitted scarf. It was Margaret Doyle. She had been the neighbor when I was a child. She used to give me butterscotch candies through the fence. She had to be in her 80s now, her face a map of deep wrinkles, her eyes sharp and bright behind thick glasses. "Mrs. Doyle?" I breathed, my heart still racing. "It is me," she said, leaning on a cane. I saw the light in the window. I knew it had to be you, or a ghost, but ghosts do not drive sedans. I walked to the railing of the porch. I was just looking for something." Margaret nodded slowly. She did not look at the broken door. She looked right at me, her gaze piercing. "Did you find it? The answer?" I froze. "What do you mean?" She took a step closer to the fence. The wind whipped her white hair around her face. "Your mother, Julia, she was a good woman, better than that man deserved, and certainly better than that blonde vulture he brought in before the dirt was even fresh on Julia's grave." Margaret looked toward the street, checking to make sure we were alone. Then she looked back at me, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The last time I saw your mother, it was right here in this backyard, 2 days before she died. She looked scared, Nevaeh. She looked like a hunted animal. She handed me a jar of peach preserves, just as an excuse to talk." Margaret paused. her gloved hand gripping the fence. She told me, "Margaret, if anything happens to me, watch the house, watch the chimney." I thought she was talking nonsense, the stress, but then she said one more thing. I gripped the railing. What did she say? She said, "If you ever see Nevaeh come back, if you ever see her open that fireplace again, you tell her to find Mercer. Tell her to find the lawyer named Mercer." Mercer? I repeated. The name meant nothing to me. "Evan Mercer," Margaret clarified. "He was a young man then. Came around here a few times with a briefcase. Quiet fellow. Looked nervous." "Do you know where he is?" I asked. Margaret shook her head. "He vanished, honey, right after the funeral. Closed up his office downtown. Gone. People said he moved west. People said he got paid off. But Julia trusted him. She said he was the only one who wouldn't burn the papers." I felt the weight of the backpack against my spine. The papers in my bag were copies. Mercer had the originals. He had to. Or maybe he had the other half of the puzzle. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, my voice trembling. "You have no idea what this means." "I think I do," the old woman said, looking at the dark house behind me. "You be careful. Nevaeh, that fire in the hearth might be cold, but the people who put it out, they are still playing with matches." She turned and hobbled back toward her own house, disappearing into the gloom of the winter afternoon. I stood there for a second, the name Evan Mercer burning in my mind. I had a name, I had the documents, and I had a witness. I ran to my car. As I fumbled with the keys, I looked back at the house one last time. It didn't look like a corpse anymore. It looked like a crime scene waiting to be solved. And I finally had the weapon to solve it. Margaret Doyle had given me a name, but she had handed me a ghost. I sat in my car, parked 2 blocks away from the Alder Street house, the engine running to keep the heater blasting against the encroaching frost. My laptop was open on the passenger seat, tethered to my phone's hotspot. I typed the name into the search bar. Evan Mercer. The results were sparse, which for a lawyer in the digital age was suspicious in itself. There were old archived court dockets from Riverton, mostly property disputes and estate filings from the late 90s and early 2000s. Then, around 15 years ago, the digital trail simply evaporated. No LinkedIn profile, no website for a private practice, no social media footprint. It was as if Evan Mercer had walked off the edge of the earth shortly after my mother's funeral. I dug deeper. I accessed the State Bar Association's public records. Evan Mercer had not been disbarred. He had voluntarily resigned his license to practice in Riverton and had transferred his status to inactive for 3 years before reinstating it in a completely different county. It took me 4 hours of cross-referencing property tax records and obscure business filings to find him. He was not in a city. He was in a town called Oak Haven, a tiny, struggling community tucked near the northern border of the state, surrounded by pine forests and silence. He was listed as a legal consultant for a tax preparation office that operated out of a converted gas station. I did not wait. I could not wait. The adrenaline from finding the documents in the fireplace was still coursing through my veins, making my hands shake on the steering wheel. I pointed my car north. The drive took 3 hours. The landscape shifted from the coastal wealth of Riverton to the desolate, snow-covered interior. By the time I rolled into Oak Haven, the sun was setting, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the empty streets. I found the office easily. It was a squat, cinder block building with a faded sign that read, "Oak Haven Tax and Legal Services." A single fluorescent light buzzed over the entrance. I parked and walked to the door. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and toner ink. A receptionist with bright red glasses looked up from a romance novel, surprised to see anyone walk in on Christmas Day. I told her I was looking for Mr. Mercer. She hesitated, glancing toward a closed door at the back. She told me he came in on holidays to avoid his empty house, but he did not take walk-ins. I told her to give him a name, not my name. "Tell him I am here about the fireplace on Alder Street," I said. The receptionist looked confused, but she picked up the phone. A moment later, the door at the back opened. A man stepped out. He was older than I expected. perhaps in his late 50s, with thinning gray hair and a posture that suggested he spent a lot of time waiting for a blow to land. He wore a cheap cardigan and spectacles that slid down his nose. He looked at me, and I saw the color drain from his face. He did not see a stranger. He saw a ghost. He saw Julia Larson. "You have her eyes," he whispered, his voice dry and cracking. "Mr. Mercer?" I said, stepping forward. "We need to talk." He did not invite me into his office. He grabbed his coat from a hook and ushered me out the front door, telling the receptionist he was taking an early dinner break. He looked left and right as we stepped onto the sidewalk, his eyes darting toward the empty street corners as if expecting a black sedan to be waiting. "Not here," he muttered. "There is a diner down the road. The booths in the back are quiet." We walked in silence. The diner was nearly empty, save for a trucker nursing a pie at the counter. We took a booth in the far corner, away from the windows. Evan ordered a black coffee. I ordered nothing. I reached into my bag and pulled out the plastic-wrapped package I had retrieved from the brickwork. I placed it on the table between us. Evan stared at it. His hand trembled as he reached out to touch the wax seal I had broken. "I did not think you would ever find it," he said softly. "I hoped you would, but I did not think you would." "Margaret told me to find you," I said. "She said my mother trusted you." "Your mother was the only client I ever had who actually cared about the law," Evan said, a sad smile touching his lips. "Everyone else just wanted to know how to get around it. Julia wanted to use it as a shield." He looked up at me, his eyes magnified by his glasses. "She knew, Nevaeh. She knew about the woman." "The woman?" I asked. "You mean Camilla?" "Before she was Camilla Larson, she was Camilla Vance," Evan said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "She was a consultant your father brought in to handle public relations for Harbor Line. Julia saw the way Richard looked at her, and she saw the way Richard started moving money around. He was liquefying assets. He was preparing for a divorce, but he wanted to make sure the settlement would be pennies on the dollar." I felt a cold knot tighten in my stomach. "So she created Juniper Trust." "She came to me in August," Evan said. "She was terrified, not for herself, but for you. She said, 'If Richard leaves me, I can survive. But if he brings that woman into this house, Nevaeh will be left with nothing.' She liquidated her own inheritance, money Richard could not touch because it came from your grandparents, and she poured it all into Juniper Trust. She transferred her 45% voting stake in Harbor Line into that trust." "And then she died," I said flatly. "And then she died," Evan repeated. He took a sip of his coffee, his hand shaking so much the liquid sloshed over the rim. "It was 3 weeks after the funeral. I was still trying to process it. I was preparing to file the trust documents with the probate court. That is when they came to my office." "Who?" "Richard and Camilla," Evan said. "They did not make an appointment. They just walked in. They locked the door behind them." He looked out the window at the falling snow, lost in the memory of that day. "Richard did the talking at first. He told me that the trust was a mistake. He said Julia was not in her right mind when she signed it. He said she was hysterical, paranoid. He wanted me to destroy the originals." "And you refused?" "I told him that as the executor of the trust, I had a fiduciary duty to you," Evan said. "I told him I would be filing the papers the next morning." Evan paused, swallowing hard. "That is when Camilla stepped in. She did not yell. She did not threaten to sue me. She just placed a briefcase on my desk. She opened it. Inside was $50,000 in cash, wrapped in bands." I stared at him. $50,000. It was a lot of money 15 years ago. But for Richard Larson, it was pocket change. "She told me that I could take the money as a consulting fee for correcting a clerical error." Evan continued. "Or I could refuse, and if I refused, she told me that things would get very difficult for me. She mentioned my wife. She mentioned the school my daughter attended. She knew the names of their teachers." My blood ran cold. "She threatened your family?" "She implied that accidents happen," Evan said. "Just like the accident that happened to Julia." The implication hung in the air between us, heavy and suffocating. "I kicked them out," Evan said, his voice gaining a shred of strength. "I told them to get out, but the next day, my office was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but my files were ransacked. The hard drive of my computer was drilled through. Then the tax audit started. Then the anonymous calls in the middle of the night. I came home one evening to find my dog dead in the backyard." He looked down at his hands. "I was a coward, Nevaeh. I panicked. I realized I was fighting people who had no bottom line. So I ran. I took the settlement money they offered later, a different offer, wired through an offshore account, and I agreed to sign a non-disclosure agreement. I agreed to disappear." "You took their money?" I asked, a flash of anger cutting through my sympathy. "I used it to move my family 3 states away," he said defensively. "I saved my daughter, but I never destroyed the proof. I knew that one day you might come looking, or I hoped you would." He reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a small object. It was a USB drive, an older model, thick and gray. He slid it across the table. "What is this?" I asked, covering it with my hand. "Insurance," Evan said. "Before they drilled my hard drive, I backed everything up. That drive contains the high-resolution scans of the original, signed Last Will and Testament of Julia Larson. It contains the audio recording of the meeting where Julia instructed me to create the trust. It contains the email chains where she details her fears about Richard's infidelity and his financial maneuvering. And most importantly, it contains the ledger." "The ledger?" "Proof," Evan said. "I tracked the shares. For a brief window of 5 days after Julia died, the 45% stake in Harborline legally sat in the Juniper Trust. Then, on September 20th, there is a digital footprint of a transfer. The shares were moved out of Juniper and into a shell company called Blue Heron Development, which is wholly owned by Camilla. Then, 2 days later, Blue Heron sold the shares back to Richard for $1. "They stole it," I whispered. "They laundered my inheritance right in front of everyone." "And this drive proves it," Evan said. "The metadata on these files is original. It will stand up in court. It proves intent. It proves conspiracy." I closed my hand around the USB drive. It felt warm from his pocket. This was it. This was the weapon I needed to kill the beast. "Why now?" I asked. "Why did you decide to reach out now? Why the note?" Evan looked at me, and for the first time, he looked truly frightened. "I heard rumors. I still keep an ear to the ground in Riverton. I heard Harborline is planning to go public next year, an IPO. If they do that, the ownership structure becomes set in stone. The history gets wiped clean. If you did not act now, you would lose that 45% forever. It would be diluted into millions of shares sold on the stock market." "So you wrote the note," I said. "You put it on my doormat." Evan nodded slowly. "I drove down on Christmas Eve. I hacked the camera system. It is a hobby I picked up over the years of being paranoid. I wanted to give you a chance." I looked at him, studying his face. "The handwriting," I said. "It looked exactly like hers. How did you do that?" "It was not a photocopy. It was fresh ink." Evan hesitated. He rubbed the back of his neck, looking uncomfortable. I traced it," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I had old letters from her. I used a lightbox. I traced the letters one by one to form the sentences." "It was perfect, Evan," I said. "Too perfect. The flow, the pressure. It did not look traced." Evan looked down at his coffee, his face pale. "I know how it sounds, Nevaeh, but when I sat down to write that note, I had the old letters in front of me, yes, but I did not look at them. I just picked up the pen, and my hand just moved." He looked up at me, his eyes wide and haunted. "I am a rational man. I deal in contracts and statutes. I do not believe in ghosts. But when I wrote that note, the room got very cold, and for a moment, I smelled lavender. A shiver ran down my spine. I touched the pocket of my coat where the original note still lay. "She is not resting, Nevaeh," Evan whispered. "She has been waiting for 15 years for someone to open that fireplace. I squeezed the USB drive tighter. She won't have to wait much longer. I stood up. You need to be ready. Evan, I am going to take this to a federal prosecutor. I am going to need you to testify. Evan looked terrified, but then he looked at the empty space on the table where the package from the fireplace had been. He took a deep breath and nodded. I am tired of running, he said. Let them come. I have kept their secrets for too long. They won't be coming for you, I said, my voice hard. They will be coming for me, and I will be waiting. I left him in the diner booth, a small, broken man finally ready to stand up. I walked back to my car, the snow crunching under my boots. The drive back to Riverton would be long and dark, but I wasn't afraid. I had the truth in my pocket, and for the first time in 15 years, I wasn't the one who needed to be scared. I pulled out my phone and dialed the number for the only person I knew who hated the Larson family as much as I did, or at least, hated what they represented. Naomi, I said when the prosecutor answered, I have something you need to see. Meet me at your office, tonight. It is Christmas, Neve. Naomi Fletcher's voice was groggy. I know, I said, and I just got the best gift of my life. I want to share it with you. I hung up and started the car. The USB drive felt heavy in my pocket, heavier than lead, heavier than gold. It was the weight of justice, and I was about to drop it right on my father's head. The digital upload bar on my laptop screen crawled to 100%, turning a satisfying shade of green. I did not just save the contents of Evan Mercer's USB drive, I weaponized them. Within an hour of leaving the diner in Oak Haven, I had created 3 redundant backups. One was on an encrypted cloud server hosted in Switzerland. One was on a physical hard drive I mailed to a P.O. box in another state under a fake name. And the third was currently sitting in the inbox of Naomi Fletcher. I called Naomi immediately after the transfer was complete. It was late on Christmas night, but she answered on the first ring. I told her to look at her secure email. I told her that the hunch she had about Harborline communities being involved in something darker than just bad zoning deals was correct. Naomi called me back 20 minutes later. Her voice, usually calm and professional, was tight with adrenaline. She told me that the stock transfer patterns in the ledger Evan provided were a direct match for a money laundering scheme the FBI had been tracking for 2 years. They had been looking for the origin point, the initial dirty transaction that funded the empire. My mother's stolen shares, laundered through the Blue Heron Shell Company, were that origin point. It was the keystone. If we pulled it out, the entire arch would collapse. Naomi told me to sit tight. She told me to lock my doors, but before I could even process her warning, my phone buzzed with a different number. It was my father. His voice was smooth, almost unrecognizable from the man who had screamed at me 15 years ago. He invited me, no, he summoned me, to the family's vacation home at Frost Cove. He said it was time to put all this ugliness behind us. He said we needed to talk. Just family, no lawyers, no courts. I knew exactly what this was. It was not a peace offering, it was an ambush. I drove out to Frost Cove the next morning. The house was a modern architectural marvel of glass and steel, cantilevered over the jagged rocks of the coastline. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress for a Bond villain. The driveway was lined with black SUVs. As I parked my modest sedan between my father's Bentley and Camilla's Porsche, I checked my coat pocket. My phone was fully charged. The voice recording app was already running. I walked up the stone steps. The door opened before I could knock. Richard and Camilla were waiting for me in the main living area. The room was breathtaking, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the gray, churning ocean. A fire roared in the modern gas fireplace, a sterile, controlled flame that lacked the warmth of the wood-burning hearth on Alder Street. Richard stood by the wet bar, pouring a glass of amber liquid. He wore a cashmere sweater and slacks, projecting the image of a relaxed patriarch. Camilla sat on a white leather sofa, her legs crossed, sipping tea. She wore no makeup, a calculated move to make her appear vulnerable and open. Nevaeh, Richard said, turning to me with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Thank you for coming. Please, sit down. I remained standing. I prefer to stand, Richard. He flinched slightly at the use of his first name. Suit yourself. I just wanted to clear the air. This lawsuit, this hostility, it is tearing us apart. It is not what your mother would have wanted. Camilla set her teacup down with a delicate clink. He is right, Neva. We have been so worried about you. We know you have been struggling since you left home. We know you feel excluded. Excluded, I repeated, tasting the word. Is that what you call grand larceny? Richard sighed, the sound of a disappointed parent dealing with a toddler. There was no larceny, Nevaeh. That is the misunderstanding we want to clear up. The documents you think you found. The things you are basing these accusations on. They are incomplete. He walked over to a side table and picked up a leather folder. He held it out to me. Your mother was a wonderful woman, Richard said, his voice dropping to a somber register. But toward the end, she was unwell. She was paranoid. She created that trust, yes, but she dissolved it herself. She realized it was a mistake. She wanted the family assets to be together, under my management, to ensure they grew for everyone, including you. She dissolved it? I asked, feigning confusion. But I have a letter where she says she feared you. Camilla laughed softly, a sad, pitying sound. Oh, honey, Julia wrote a lot of things. She was on medication. She had mood swings. We tried to protect her reputation by keeping those ramblings private. We did not want you to remember her as unstable. The gaslighting was masterful. If I did not have Evan Mercer's testimony, if I did not have the metadata proving the shares were stolen after her death, I might have doubted myself. They were weaving a reality where they were the protectors and I was the confused victim. So it was all for my benefit? I asked, stepping closer to the sofa. Everything we do is for family, Richard said firmly, and we want to prove it. He opened the folder on the coffee table. Inside was a cashier's check. I glanced at the numbers. $2 million. Next to it was a deed to a penthouse apartment in the most expensive building in downtown Riverton. This is your share, Richard said. We liquidated some old assets. We want you to have this. It is enough to set you up for life. You can quit that job at the data firm. You can travel. You can start your own business. You can be free. And what do I have to do? I asked, looking from the check to his face. Richard slid a document across the table. It was thick, stapled at the corner. Just a standard agreement. It states that you acknowledge the trust was dissolved legally. It states that you will withdraw your lawsuit with prejudice. And it includes a confidentiality clause. We keep this family business private. No press, no prosecutors. I looked at the document. It was a gag order. It was a bribe. I realized then that they did not know. They did not know I had found Evan Mercer. They did not know I had the USB drive. They thought I was operating on the scraps I found in the fireplace, the copies, the old letters. They thought they could buy me off because they assumed I had no real leverage. I needed them to say it. I needed them to admit the crime on tape. $2 million, I said, my voice shaking with feigned hesitation. That is a lot of money, but what about the box? The Christmas box? Camilla stiffened, her eyes narrowed. I still have nightmares about that night. I lied, looking directly at her. You hit me. You were so angry. Richard said the box contained things that would cause trouble. If Mom was just confused, why were you so terrified of me opening a simple gift? I was not terrified, Camilla snapped, her mask slipping. I was disciplining a rude child. It felt like more than that, I pressed. You burned the note. Camilla, you put the key in your pocket. You acted like I had found a bomb. Because it was a bomb, Camilla outburst, standing up abruptly. Richard shot her a warning look. Camilla, sit down. No. Richard, she said, her voice rising. She turned on me, her eyes blazing with the same cold fire I remembered from 15 years ago. You think you are so smart, Nevaeh. You think you are the victim. You were an ungrateful little spy. I told you not to open that box because I knew what poison your mother had put in there. Poison? I asked softly. You mean the deed to the trust? I mean the lies, Camilla shouted. She wanted to cut us out. She wanted to give a teenager control of a company that Richard built from the ground up. Do you have any idea how insulted I was? After everything I did to help him fix his image, she tried to hand the keys to the kingdom to you from beyond the grave. Camilla, Richard barked. But she was too far gone. Her ego, bruised by my defiance, demanded she assert her dominance. I did what I had to do, Camilla hissed, stepping toward me. I took that key because I was protecting this family from financial ruin. You were 18. You would have destroyed Harborline in a month. Yes, I burned the note, and I would do it again, because everything we have, this house, the cars, the life you are so jealous of, exists because we took control. We fixed her mess. We took control, I repeated. So you admit you took the shares? You admit you moved them out of the trust after she died? Richard slammed his hand on the wet bar. That is enough. He walked over to me, looming tall and threatening. You are twisting words. Nevaeh, we manage the assets. That is all. Now, look at the offer on the table. $2 million. Take it, sign the paper, and walk away. Because if you do not, if you insist on dragging this out, that offer disappears, and you will be left with nothing, no money, no family, and we will bury you in legal fees until you are living on the street. I looked at him. I looked at the check. It represented the easy way out. It was the path of least resistance. But then I thought about Evan Mercer hiding in a gas station for a decade. I thought about my mother dying in a car accident that everyone was too afraid to investigate. I thought about the 3 minutes of missing security footage. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I tapped the screen, stopping the recording. I held it up so they could see the red waveform on the display. I think, I said, my voice steady and cold as the ocean outside, that this conversation will be very interesting to the U.S. Attorney. The silence that fell over the room was absolute. Richard stared at the phone. His face went from red to a ghostly pale in the span of a second. He realized instantly what had happened. He had just offered a bribe to silence a witness in a federal investigation. He had just confirmed the motive for the fraud. Camilla looked confused for a moment, and then terrified. What is that? What are you doing? I am declining your offer, I said. I do not want your $2 million. Richard, I do not want your condo, and I certainly do not want your silence. I took a step back toward the door. I want the 45%. I want the company, and I want to see you both in handcuffs. You little bitch, Camilla shrieked. She grabbed her teacup and hurled it at me. It missed my head by inches and shattered against the steel door frame, spraying hot tea and porcelain shards across the floor. Camilla, stop, Richard roared. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fury. You cannot use that. It is inadmissible. Two-party consent laws. Actually, I interrupted, Maine is a one-party consent state. As long as I am part of the conversation, I can record it, and I just did. I opened the door, letting the cold sea air rush into the overheated room. Give me the phone, Richard said, moving toward me. His voice was low, dangerous. Nevaeh, give me the phone right now. I already sent the file to the cloud. I lied, though the auto backup would kick in the moment I hit a strong signal. And Naomi Fletcher is waiting for me. If I am not back in Riverton in 2 hours, the FBI comes to knock on your door. Richard stopped. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw him not as a titan of industry, but as an old man who had built his castle on sand. You do not understand what you are doing, he snarled, his voice trembling with rage. You are destroying your own legacy. You are burning down the house while you are still inside it. No, Father, I said. I am just opening the windows. The smoke was killing me. I stepped out onto the porch. Nevaeh! Camilla screamed from inside, her voice shrill and desperate. You will regret this. You will rot in hell for this. I did not look back. I walked down the stone steps to my car. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a sledgehammer, but my hands were steady. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw Richard standing in the massive glass window of the living room. He was watching me go. He looked small against the gray backdrop of the storm-tossed sea. He raised a hand, pointing a finger at me, mouthing words I could not hear. "You do not know what you are up against." He was wrong. I knew exactly what I was up against. I was up against greed. I was up against fear. And for the first time in my life, I was armed. I drove away from Frost Cove, leaving the bribe and the threats behind. I had the recording. I had the confession. But as I merged onto the highway, a black SUV pulled out from a side road behind me. It kept its distance, but it matched my speed. I checked my rearview mirror. Tinted windows, no license plate on the front. Richard had let me leave the house, but he had not let me go. The legal battle was just beginning, but the war for my survival had just started. I gripped the wheel and pressed the accelerator. I had a long drive back to Naomi, and I had a feeling the road was about to get very dangerous. The war did not begin with a bang. It began with the quiet, humiliating click of a credit card chip reader declining a transaction for a $3 cup of coffee. I stood at the counter of the coffee shop on the corner of 4th and Main, staring at the little screen that flashed "Transaction denied." The line behind me was long, filled with impatient commuters checking their watches. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a familiar flush of shame that I had not felt since I was a teenager begging Camilla for lunch money. I pulled out my backup card, a debit card from a different bank. Declined. I paid with the crumpled $5 bill I found in my coat pocket and walked out into the biting wind, my hands shaking. A notification popped up on my phone. Security alert. Due to suspicious activity, your accounts have been temporarily frozen pending a fraud investigation. It was Richard. Of course it was Richard. He could not legally fire me, and he could not legally arrest me, so he was trying to starve me out. He was showing me that even at 33 years old, living on my own, he still held the invisible leash that controlled my survival. By the time I reached my office at Blue Bridge Analytics, the second wave hit. My keycard did not work on the lobby turnstile. The security guard, a man named Mike, who usually asked me about my weekend, refused to look me in the eye. He simply buzzed me in and pointed toward the elevators with a grim expression. When I got to my desk, my computer was gone. My boss, a woman named Sarah, who had mentored me for 3 years, was waiting in her glass-walled office. She looked pale. She did not ask me to sit down. She handed me a letter. Internal Compliance Review. We received an anonymous tip. Nevaeh, Sarah said, her voice tight. Allegations regarding the misuse of client data for personal financial gain. We have to suspend you pending an investigation. You know this is a lie, I said, my voice trembling with rage. You know who my father is. You know he is doing this. It is out of my hands, Sarah said, looking down at her desk. Security will escort you out. I walked out of the building carrying a cardboard box with a potted plant and a stapler, feeling the eyes of my coworkers burning into my back. They were not just attacking my bank account, they were attacking my character. They were painting a picture of a dishonest, unstable woman, laying the groundwork to discredit me before I ever took the stand. If I was a thief at work, who would believe I was a victim in court? I drove home, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I needed to call Naomi. I needed to tell her that the intimidation had started. But when I turned the key in the lock of my apartment door, the mechanism gave way too easily. The wood of the frame was splintered. I pushed the door open, my breath hitched in my throat. My sanctuary, my industrial loft in the warehouse district, had been gutted. It looked as though a tornado had materialized in the center of the living room. Books were pulled from the shelves, their spines broken. Cushions were slashed open, stuffing bleeding out onto the floor. My drawers had been pulled out and dumped. My mattress was overturned. They had not taken the television. They had not taken my jewelry. They were not looking for money. They were looking for paper. I stepped over a pile of shattered plates in the kitchen. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the anger. They had been here, Richard's men, or Camilla's. They had touched my things. They had violated the one space I had carved out for myself in this world. Neve? I spun around. Naomi Fletcher was standing in the open doorway, her hand resting on the holster at her hip. She had arrived before I even called her, likely alerted by the same silent alarm that had failed to stop the intruders. "You cannot stay here," Naomi said, surveying the wreckage. "This is an escalation. We have a safe house near the federal building. Pack a bag." "No," I said, kicking a pile of torn magazines. "This is not a negotiation," Naomi said, stepping over the debris. "They broke into your home. Next time, they might wait for you to come back." "I am not leaving," I insisted. "If I run, they win. If I hide, they spin the narrative that I am guilty and fleeing. I stay here. I get the locks changed. I get a gun. But I stay." "You are being stubborn," Naomi said, but I could see the respect in her eyes. "I will have a patrol car parked outside, but the original letter, the one from the fireplace, it goes into federal evidence lockup. Tonight?" I nodded. That was a compromise I could make. Naomi left to coordinate with the police. I spent the next 4 hours cleaning up the mess, putting my life back together piece by piece. It was midnight by the time I finished. The apartment still felt violated, the air heavy with the scent of strangers. I went to the kitchen to pour a glass of water. I reached for a glass from the upper cabinet, and when I turned back to the island, I dropped it. The glass shattered on the floor, but I did not hear it. All I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears. On the kitchen table, right in the center of the surface I had just wiped clean an hour ago, was a piece of paper. It was white. It was folded once. I had not left the apartment. The patrol car was outside. I had checked every closet, every corner. I was alone. Or I thought I was. I walked toward the table, my legs feeling like lead. I picked up the note. The paper was the same high-quality stock as the first one. The ink was the same black fountain pen. "If you want them unable to erase the truth, look under the lid of grandmother's music box. J." I stared at the signature. J. The handwriting was identical to my mother's. It was the same ghostly script that Evan Mercer had claimed he traced. But this felt different. How did this get here? Had someone been hiding in the apartment the whole time? In the vents? Or had they slipped in while I was arguing with Naomi, moving like a phantom? I reread the message. Grandmother's music box. The memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. Grandma Eleanor, my father's mother. She had been the only person in that house who showed me kindness before she died when I was 10. She had a music box, an antique thing made of inlaid rosewood that played a sad, beautiful waltz. I used to sit on her lap and watch the little golden cylinder turn. But the music box was gone. I remembered the day it vanished. It was 3 years after Eleanor died, and 2 years after Camilla moved in. Camilla had decided the house needed updating. She had purged the old antiques. She organized a high-profile charity auction to benefit the local art museum, a vanity project to cement her status as a philanthropist. I remembered begging her not to sell the box. I remembered her laughing, calling it tacky Victorian junk, and watching the gavel fall. I grabbed my phone and dialed Naomi. "I need you to run a name," I said, skipping the greeting. "Or rather, an item, the Larson Charity Gala, 2010, lot number 42, an antique rosewood music box." "Neve, it is 2 a.m, Naomi groaned. "There was another note," I said. "It was on my table, tonight." The sleep vanished from Naomi's voice instantly. "I am coming over." "No," I said. "Just find the buyer, please." Naomi worked fast. By sunrise, we were sitting in a diner near the courthouse, armed with a printout of the auction records. "It took some digging," Naomi said, sliding a paper across the table. "The buyer list was sealed, ostensibly for privacy, but really because half the people bidding were laundering money through tax-deductible donations. But the auction house keeps records." She tapped a name on the list. Leo Harrington. I frowned. Who is he? On paper, he was a mid-level antique dealer from Boston, Naomi said. But here is where it gets interesting. Leo Harrington does not exist anymore. 3 years ago, he vanished, but his social security number popped up on a flagged list in the Justice Department database. Naomi lowered her voice, leaning in. He is in witness protection. Nevaeh. Or he was. He was a witness in a RICO case against the Verducci crime family in New York. He was their accountant for legitimate assets. What does a mob accountant have to do with my grandmother's music box? I asked. That is what I asked myself, Naomi said. So I cross-referenced Leo's old financials, the ones we seized, with the USB drive Evan gave you. She pulled out a second sheet of paper. It was a spreadsheet with highlighted rows. Look at the dates. September 20th, 2001, the day your mother's shares were moved out of Juniper Trust. I looked. There was a transfer of funds, $300,000, from Juniper Trust to an account held by L. Harrington Antiques. Then, 2 days later, a transfer of exactly $300,000 from L. Harrington Antiques to Blue Heron Development, Camilla's shell company. He was a mule, I whispered. They used him to wash the transaction fees, to make it look like a legitimate business purchase. And as a thank you, or perhaps as collateral, he bought items at their charity auctions. Naomi said, he bought the music box. It wasn't just a purchase. It was a trophy, or maybe a storage device. The note said to look under the lid, I said. My mother must have hidden something in there before she died. Maybe she gave it to Eleanor? No, Eleanor died before Mom. Maybe Mom hid it there knowing it was the one thing in the house Camilla wouldn't look closely at because she hated it. But Camilla sold it, Naomi said. So whatever was in there is gone. Unless Leo found it, I said. Or unless the note writer knows Leo has it. We need to find Leo, Naomi said. If he is in witness protection, I cannot just call him, but I can pull strings. I can get a message to his handler. The day dragged on. The city felt hostile. Every time I saw a black SUV, my heart skipped a beat. I stayed in public spaces, moving from coffee shop to library, afraid to go back to my apartment. By evening, Naomi called. I found him, she said. He is out of the program. He left voluntarily 6 months ago. He is living off the grid in a cabin near Lake Arrowhead. But Nevaeh, there is something else. The FBI file on him mentions that he claimed to have insurance against his former employers. He never turned it over. The music box, I said. Maybe, Naomi said. I am sending a team to bring him in. We will have him by tomorrow morning, just in time for the hearing. I went back to my apartment that night. I checked the locks. I propped a chair under the handle. I sat on the floor of the living room, surrounded by the ruins of my life, clutching the USB drive in one hand and my phone in the other. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. It sounded like the city was screaming. At 11:55, my phone rang. It was a blocked number. I stared at the screen. My instructions from Naomi were clear. Do not answer unknown calls, but the curiosity was a physical itch. I swiped answer. Hello? There was a pause. Static crackled on the line, sounding like rain on a tin roof. The music box is no longer the problem, a voice said. It was synthesized, distorted, impossible to identify. It sounded like a machine trying to mimic a human soul. Who is this? I demanded. Did you leave the note? Leo Harrington is dead, the voice said, cold and flat. They found him an hour ago, heart attack, very sudden, very convenient. My blood froze. What? The box is gone. Nevaeh, burned, crushed, whatever was under the lid, it is ash now. Then you lost, I said, fighting the tears of frustration. You led me to a dead end. No, the voice said. I led you to a distraction. While they were busy hunting down an old man in a wooden box, they stopped watching the digital trail. What do you mean? All the answers were already in your hand, the voice said. Everything in that box, the microfilm, the codes. It was all scanned. It has been on the USB drive the whole time. You just did not look deep enough. "Who are you?" I screamed into the phone. "Why are you doing this?" "Look at the file named Eleanor," the voice said. "And do not trust the prosecutor with the password yet. Not until you see what is inside." The line clicked dead. I sat there in the silence, the phone warm against my ear. Leo was dead. The music box was gone. The second note had been a lure. Bait to make Richard and Camilla show their hand, to make them expend resources cleaning up a loose end while the real evidence sat in my pocket. I plugged the USB drive into my laptop. I opened the file directory. I had looked at this drive 100 times. I had seen the will, the emails, the ledger. But I had never enabled Show Hidden Files. I clicked the option. A new folder appeared. It was faint, transparent on the screen. It was labeled simply, Eleanor. I double-clicked it. A password prompt appeared. I typed in the only thing that made sense. I typed the name of the song the music box used to play. Claire de Lune. The folder opened. And as I watched the thumbnails of hundreds of documents load onto my screen, I realized the voice was right. The music box didn't matter. The house didn't matter. This was not just about stealing a company. This was about where the money for the company came from in the first place. And the names on these documents were not just Richard and Camilla. They were names of senators, judges, and, terrifyingly, a senior partner at the law firm where Naomi Fletcher used to work. I closed the laptop slowly. The trial started tomorrow, and I suddenly realized that I wasn't just walking into a courtroom. I was walking into a slaughterhouse, and I wasn't sure anymore who was holding the knife. The gavel banged against the wooden block, a sharp, hollow sound that signaled the beginning of my public execution. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap that my knuckles had turned white. The air in the courtroom was stale, recycled, and thick with the scent of anticipation. To the jury, to the press packed in the back rows, and to the curious citizens of Riverton, this was theater. It was the fall of a local dynasty, a soap opera playing out in real time. But to me, it was a nightmare loop. Mark Duvall, the lead attorney for the Larson family, stood up. He was a man who wore suits that cost more than most people's cars, with a smile that was charming enough to hide the shark teeth beneath. He did not look at me with malice. He looked at me with pity. It was a calculated look, designed to frame the narrative before a single word of testimony was spoken. He called his first witness, Camilla Larson. She walked to the stand with the grace of a grieving queen. She wore a soft, powder blue suit, a color chosen specifically to convey innocence and vulnerability. She had forgone her usual heavy jewelry for a simple string of pearls. When she took the oath, her voice trembled just enough to be audible, just enough to sound like a mother who was heartbroken to be testifying against her own child. Duvall guided her gently through the preliminary questions. Then, he pivoted to the heart of the matter. "Mrs. Larson," he said softly, "can you describe your relationship with your stepdaughter, Nevaeh, during her teenage years?" Camilla sighed, looking down at her hands. "I tried," she said, her voice catching. "I tried so hard to be a mother to her after Julia passed. I knew I could never replace her mother. But I wanted to be a friend, a guide. But Nevaeh, she was struggling, she was angry, and she directed all that anger at me." "Can you give the court an example?" Duvall asked. "There were so many outbursts," Camilla said, looking up with wide, sad eyes. "She would scream at the staff. She would lock herself in her room for days. But the worst was that Christmas. The Christmas when she turned 18. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Here it comes. "Tell us what happened," Duvall prompted. "We had a tradition," Camilla said, turning slightly to address the jury directly. "We waited until everyone was together on Christmas morning to open gifts. It was about family unity. But that night, Nevaeh snuck downstairs. She tore into the gifts like a wild animal. She destroyed the wrapping, the boxes. When I found her, she was screaming. She was hysterical. Did she attack you? She was flailing, Camilla lied, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I tried to calm her down. I tried to take the box away from her because she was ripping it apart. She claims I hit her, but I was just trying to restrain a child who was having a breakdown. I was trying to stop her from hurting herself. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. It was a perfect lie. She had taken the violence of that night, the slap, the rage, the burning of the note, and twisted it into an act of maternal protection. She had erased the key. She had erased the message from my mother. She had reduced my desperate search for connection to a temper tantrum. She has always had a problem with boundaries, Camilla continued, wiping her eyes with a tissue Duval handed her. She felt entitled to everything. She thought the rules did not apply to her. And when we tried to set limits, she called it abuse. The jury was nodding. I could see it. They were looking at the poised, weeping woman on the stand, and then looking at me, the cold, silent plaintiff in the black suit. They saw a saint and a sinner. Duval sat down, looking satisfied. Naomi leaned over to me. "Do not react," she whispered. "If you look angry, you prove her point." Next came Richard. My father walked to the stand with the weight of the world on his shoulders. He played the part of the reluctant patriarch perfectly. He did not look at me. He looked at the flag in the corner of the room. "Mr. Larson," Duval asked, "the plaintiff claims that you and your wife conspired to defraud her of her inheritance, that you stole shares belonging to her late mother. How do you respond to that?" "It is absurd," Richard said, his voice deep and gravelly. "Everything I did to protect this family, and to protect the company. Harborline Communities is not just a business, it is a responsibility. We employ thousands of people in this state." "Why was Nevaeh not given a leadership role in the company?" Duval asked. "If she was the heir?" Richard shook his head sadly. "I wanted to bring her in. I really did. But Nevaeh, she has no head for business. She is reckless. When she worked for us briefly as an intern, she proposed investments that were frankly dangerous." "Dangerous how?" "She wanted to move capital into high-risk offshore ventures," Richard lied smoothly. "She talked about bypassing regulatory oversight to maximize short-term gains. It was gambling. I had to overrule her. I had to protect the shareholders from her decisions." I stared at him, my mouth slightly open. He was projecting. He was taking the very crimes he had committed, the laundering, the offshore shell companies, the risky maneuvers with the mob's money, and pinning them on me. He was painting me as the one who wanted to break the law, and himself as the steadfast guardian of ethics. "I had to cut her off," Richard said, looking at me for the first time. His eyes were hard, devoid of love. "Not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I could not let her destroy what her mother and I built. She sees that as theft. I see it as stewardship." The gallery murmured in agreement. Of course, the responsible father cutting off the prodigal daughter. It was a story as old as time, and they were eating it up. Then came the evidence. Duval approached the projector screen. "I would like to submit Exhibit D into evidence," he announced. "These are a series of emails sent from the plaintiff to the defendant over the last 3 years." The screen lit up. I saw the headers. They were my emails, but they looked wrong. Duval read the highlighted portions aloud. "I need the money. Richard, you owe me this. If you do not pay me what I am worth, I will make sure everyone knows what you did." The gasp from the gallery was audible. "And this one," Duval continued, "I do not care about the company. I just want my share. Cash me out and I will disappear." "Objection!" Naomi stood up, her voice cutting through the room. "These emails are taken completely out of context. The full threads show that my client was referring to the specific trust fund established by her mother, not a bribe." "The documents speak for themselves, Your Honor," Duval said smoothly. "They show a pattern of extortion. Miss Larson was not looking for justice. She was looking for a payout." The judge overruled the objection. The emails stayed on the screen. I felt sick. Those emails were real, but they had been surgically altered. He had cut out the sentences where I referenced the Juniper Trust. He had cut out the parts where I begged him to just show me the ledger. Without that context, I sounded like a greedy blackmailer threatening her family for cash. I looked at the jury. They were looking at me with disgust. The sympathy I had hoped to garner was evaporating by the second. But they were not done. They had one final weapon to deploy. "The defense calls Dr. Eris Thorne," Duvall announced. A tall, thin man with wire-rimmed glasses walked to the stand. I recognized him immediately. He was the therapist Camilla had forced me to see for 6 months after I turned 19, threatening to cut off my college tuition if I refused. "Dr. Thorne," Duvall said, "you treated Miss Larson nearly 14 years ago. Can you describe her mental state at that time?" "I can," Thorne said, his voice clinical and detached. Nevaeh presented with symptoms of prolonged grief disorder, compounded by a persecution complex. She exhibited signs of mild paranoia. "Paranoia?" Duvall asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes," Thorne nodded. "She frequently spoke of conspiracies. She believed her family was plotting against her. She believed her stepmother was hiding messages from her deceased mother. She had trouble distinguishing between her emotional reality and objective facts. In your professional opinion, Doctor," Duvall said, leaning on the railing of the witness box, "is it possible that this entire lawsuit, these elaborate claims of hidden safes and secret wills, is a manifestation of that same paranoia?" "It is consistent with her diagnosis," Thorne said. "She creates narratives where she is the victim of a grand plot to avoid facing the reality of her situation." I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up and shout that Thorne was on Richard's payroll, that he had spent our sessions asking me about my father's business dealings rather than my feelings. But I sat frozen. The testimony ended. The court adjourned for the day. As I walked out of the courtroom, the noise was deafening. The press was waiting in the corridor. Flashbulbs popped in my face, blinding me. "Nevaeh, is it true you tried to extort your father? Did you really attack your stepmother on Christmas? Are you doing this just for the money?" The headlines were already being written. The ungrateful daughter, the Larson family feud, greed or madness. I kept my head down, pushing through the crowd. I could hear the whispers of the people in the hallway. "She looks crazy, doesn't she?" Imagine doing that to your own parents. Rich kids, they are never satisfied. I felt stripped naked. 15 years ago, Camilla had slapped me in the privacy of a study. Today, she had slapped me in front of the entire world. She had taken my trauma, my grief, and my desperate fight for the truth, and she had turned it into a weapon to discredit me. She had made me look like the villain in my own story. I reached the safety of the conference room Naomi had reserved. I collapsed into a chair. Burying my face in my hands, I was shaking. "We lost," I whispered. "They believe them. Everyone believes them." "Nevaeh, look at me," Naomi said. Her voice was sharp, commanding. I looked up. Naomi was not panicked. She was not defeated. She was pacing the room, her eyes burning with a fierce, cold light. "We did not lose," Naomi said. "We just survived the first wave. This is how it works. They tell their story first. They paint the picture. They build the castle." She walked over to the whiteboard where she had outlined our strategy. She picked up a red marker. "They think they won because they silenced you today," Naomi said. "They think that by calling you crazy, they can make the evidence disappear, but they made a mistake." "What mistake?" I asked, wiping a tear from my cheek. "They committed to a narrative," Naomi said, smiling grimly. "They went on record. Richard said under oath that he never touched the trust. Camilla said under oath that the box contained nothing but nonsense. Dr. Thorne said you are paranoid for believing in secret wills." Naomi uncapped the marker and drew a big red X through the name Dr. Thorne. "Tomorrow," Naomi said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "We introduce the USB drive. Tomorrow, we introduce Evan Mercer. Tomorrow, we play the tape from Frost Cove." She walked over to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. "They told a beautiful story, Nevaeh. It was perfect. It was emotional. It was compelling." She leaned down, her eyes locking with mine. But tomorrow is our day, and tomorrow, we do not just tell a story, we drop a bomb. We are going to take every lie they told today and ram it right back down their throats. They built a glass house, Neva, and you are holding the sledgehammer. I looked at her. I took a deep breath. The shaking in my hands stopped. The shame I had felt in the hallway began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. They had laughed at me. They had mocked me. They had called me crazy. Let them laugh for one more night. Get the sledgehammer, I said. I am ready to swing. The courtroom air on the second day felt different. Yesterday, it had been heavy with judgment. A suffocating blanket of disapproval draped over my shoulders. Today, it was electric. Naomi walked in not with the weary gait of a defender, but with the sharp, predatory stride of a hunter who has spotted wounded prey. She carried the USB drive in her hand like a grenade, and I sat down at the plaintiff's table, no longer the cowering daughter, but the soldier ready to light the fuse. Mark Duval looked comfortable, leaning back in his chair, sharing a joke with Richard. They thought the war was over. They thought they had buried me under the testimony of a bought therapist and a weeping stepmother. Call your first witness, the judge said. Naomi stood up. She did not look at the jury. She looked directly at Richard. The plaintiff calls Evan Mercer. The name landed like a physical blow. I saw Richard's head snap up. Camilla froze, her hand halfway to her water glass. Duval frowned, shuffling through his papers, clearly scrambling to recall a name he thought had been erased from history. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened. A federal marshal stepped in first, followed by Evan. He looked cleaner than he had in the diner, wearing a suit that was clearly new and slightly ill-fitting, but his head was high. He walked down the aisle, ignoring the death glare Richard was shooting at him. When Evan took the stand, the silence was absolute. Mr. Mercer, Naomi began, her voice projecting clearly to the back of the room, please state your former occupation. I was an estate attorney practicing here in Riverton, Evan said, his voice steady. I represented Julia Larson. And why did you leave Riverton 15 years ago? Because I was threatened, Evan said. I was told that if I did not destroy my client's files, my family would suffer the same fate as my client. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Duval jumped up. Objection! Hearsay! Inflammatory! It goes to the state of mind of the witness and explains the gap in the chain of custody for the evidence we are about to present. Naomi argued calmly. Overruled, the judge said. Proceed. Naomi plugged the USB drive into the court's presentation system. Mr. Mercer, did Julia Larson instruct you to create a specific financial instrument before she died? She did, Evan said. She instructed me to create the Juniper Trust. Its sole purpose was to hold 45% of the voting stock of Harborline Communities, protecting it from her husband, Richard Larson, whom she intended to divorce. On the large screen above the jury box, a document appeared. It was the deed of trust I had found in the fireplace, but this was the digital scan of the original, pristine, unblemished by time or brick dust. And is this the last will and testament of Julia Larson? Naomi asked, pulling up the next file. It is, Evan confirmed. I drafted it. She signed it in my presence on August 15th, 2001. The document zoomed in on the signature. Then, it zoomed in on the clause that left everything to me. Not a trust fund, not an allowance, the company. Naomi turned to the jury. The defense told you yesterday that Julia Larson was paranoid. They told you she was mentally unstable. Does this document look like the scribblings of a madwoman? Or does it look like a meticulously crafted legal shield? She called her next witness immediately. Dr. Arlene Weiss, a forensic handwriting expert. Dr. Weiss was not a small-town therapist. She was a legend in the federal court system. Dr. Weiss stood before the screen, a laser pointer in her hand. She put two images side by side. On the left was the will filed by Richard 15 years ago, the one that disinherited me. On the right was the will from the USB. The document on the left, Dr. Weiss explained, her voice dry and authoritative. Shows clear signs of digital manipulation. The signature has been lifted from a tax return filed 3 years prior. You can see the pixelation artifacts here and here. It is a forgery, a clumsy one. She pointed to the document on the right. This signature, however, shows natural fluid dynamics consistent with a fountain pen. The pressure points match Julia Larson's known exemplars perfectly. This is the authentic document. I looked at the jury. They were no longer looking at me with disgust. They were leaning forward, their eyes darting from the screen to Richard. The narrative of the crazy daughter was dissolving, replaced by the image of a dead woman reaching out from the grave to point a finger at her husband. But Naomi was just getting started. "We have heard a lot about protecting the family," Naomi said, pacing in front of the witness stand. "Mr. Larson testified that he only moved assets to safeguard the company. Let's see how that protection discussion actually sounded." She clicked a file on the laptop. A video window opened on the big screen. The video was grainy, black and white, taken from a security camera in what looked like a conference room. The timestamp in the corner read September 12, 2001, 2 days after my mother died. Richard and Camilla were sitting at a table. There was no audio at first, just the hum of the tape. Then, the voices kicked in, restored, amplified, and damning. "We cannot file the will." Richard's voice filled the courtroom. "If the court sees the Juniper Clause, I lose control. The board will oust me." "Then don't let them see it," Camilla's voice replied. She looked younger, sharper. "Move the shares. Create a shell. Call it, I don't know, Blue Heron. Transfer the stock there for a nominal fee before probate opens. By the time anyone looks, the trust will be empty." "That is fraud, Camilla," Richard said. Though he did not sound horrified, he sounded calculating. "It is survival," Camilla snapped. "Do you want that brat running your company, or do you want to keep your house?" The video cut to black. The courtroom was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop. Duval had his head in his hands. Richard was staring at the table. His jaw clenched so hard, a muscle was jumping in his cheek. Camilla was pale, her perfect composure cracking like a porcelain doll dropped on concrete. They had been caught, not on a technicality, not on a hearsay claim. They were caught on tape, conspiring to steal a fortune while my mother's body was barely cold. "Objection!" Duval croaked, standing up slowly. We have not had time to authenticate this footage. It comes from your client's own server backup, recovered by Mr. Mercer," Naomi said icily. "But if you want more authentication, let's ask someone who was part of the money trail." Naomi turned to the back of the room again. "The plaintiff calls Leo Harrington." This was the moment, the twist. I held my breath. Just last night, a synthesized voice had told me Leo was dead. They had tried to break me with fear. The doors opened. An elderly man in a wheelchair was pushed into the room by a federal agent. He looked frail, his skin papery, but his eyes were alive. He held an oxygen tank in his lap. I looked at Richard. His face went slack with shock. He looked as if he had seen a corpse walk through the door. Leo took the oath. His voice was wheezy, but clear. "Mr. Harrington," Naomi said gently, "can you tell the court why you are here today?" "Because I am tired of hiding," Leo wheezed. "And because the feds promised they wouldn't prosecute me for the Verducci account if I gave up the Larsons." "Did you purchase an antique rosewood music box at a charity auction in 2010? "I did," Leo said. "Bought it from her." He pointed a shaking finger at Camilla. "And why did you buy it?" "It wasn't for the music," Leo rasped. "I was moving money for them. They needed to clean the cash from the Juniper transfer. I bought junk at their auctions at inflated prices. The money went to the charity. The charity hired Richard's consulting firm. The money went back to Richard. Circle of life." "But did you find anything in the box?" Naomi asked. "I dropped it," Leo said, a dry chuckle escaping his lips. "Clumsy hands. The bottom panel popped open. False bottom." He reached into the pocket of his cardigan and pulled out a Ziploc bag. Inside were folded papers. "Receipts," Leo said. Bank transfer slips from Juniper Trust to Blue Heron, signed by Richard Larson, and a copy of the real will. Julia must have hidden them there right before she died. She knew Camilla hated that box, knew she wouldn't look inside. And why did you keep them? Insurance, Leo said, looking directly at Richard. In my line of work, you never throw away leverage. I heard you tried to tell the girl I was dead last night. Richard, that was a mistake. Made me realize you were tying up loose ends. So I called the lady prosecutor. The gallery erupted. The judge banged the gavel furiously, demanding order. I sat back in my chair, feeling a wave of vindication wash over me. The voice on the phone. It must have been Richard's fixer, trying to scare me off. But in doing so, they had driven Leo right into Naomi's arms. Naomi waited for the noise to die down. She had destroyed their defense. She had proven the forgery, the theft, and the conspiracy. Now, she just needed to break the woman who started it all. I would like to recall Camilla Larson to the stand, Naomi said. Camilla stood up. Her legs were shaky. She walked to the witness box, but the queenly grace was gone. She looked cornered. Naomi walked up to her. She did not yell. She stood very close, her voice quiet and dangerous. Mrs. Larson, Naomi said, we have seen the video. We have seen the will. We know you moved the money, but there is one thing I still don't understand. Naomi leaned in. Why the slap? Camilla blinked. Excuse me? 15 years ago, Naomi said. Christmas Eve, Nevaeh opened a gift. You slapped her. You screamed at her. You burned the note inside. Why? She was being disobedient, Camilla stammered, reverting to her script. It was about discipline. Was it? Naomi asked. Or was it panic? Because that note mentioned the fireplace, and you knew what was in the fireplace, didn't you? I didn't know anything, Camilla said, her voice rising in pitch. It was just a stupid box. Julia wrote to Nevaeh about assets to protect her, Naomi pressed. You saw that note. You read it before you burned it. You realized that Julia had left a roadmap to the Juniper Trust. And if Nevaeh found it, your entire scheme, the scheme you and Richard were hatching in that video, would be exposed before it even started. No, Camilla cried. I was trying to protect the family. Which family? Naomi snapped. The one you stole? You saw an 18-year-old girl holding the key to your prison cell, and you hit her. You didn't hit her because she opened a gift early. You hit her because she almost caught you. She was ruining everything, Camilla screamed, losing control. She stood up in the witness box, her face contorted with hate. We worked so hard. Richard and I, we fixed that company. Julia was weak. She was going to give it all to a child. I just didn't want her to destroy what we built. The courtroom froze. Naomi took a step back, letting the words hang in the air. What you built, Naomi asked softly, or what Julia left for her daughter, and you tried to erase from the financial map? Camilla's mouth opened, then closed. She looked at Richard. He had his eyes closed, defeat etched into every line of his face. She looked at the jury. They were staring at her with horror. She realized what she had said. She had admitted ownership of the scheme. She had admitted the motive. Camilla whispered, sinking back into the chair. I didn't mean... No further questions, Naomi said. She walked back to the plaintiff's table, but she didn't sit down immediately. She reached into her folder and pulled out one last piece of evidence. It wasn't a digital file. It wasn't a video. It was the piece of paper that had been left on my doormat on Christmas morning, the note that started it all. Naomi walked to the judge's bench. Your Honor, I would like to submit one final piece of evidence into the record, the note that led the plaintiff to the discovery of these crimes. She placed it on the evidence table, right under the harsh glare of the overhead light. The old fireplace remains. J. The camera zoomed in on it. The signature J filled the screens in the courtroom. It was elegant. It was defiant. I looked at it, and for a moment, the sounds of the courtroom faded away. I didn't see the lawyers or the judge. I just saw that letter J. It didn't matter who had physically written it, whether it was Evan tracing old letters or something more inexplicable. What mattered was that it was her voice. My mother had been the silent partner in this trial. She had been the one guiding me through the snow, through the fireplace, through the lies. Camilla stared at the note on the screen. She looked terrified of it, as if the paper itself was haunting her. Naomi sat down next to me. She didn't smile. She just squeezed my hand under the table. "We broke the glass house," she whispered. I looked at Richard and Camilla. They were small now. The tycoon and the socialite were gone. All that remained were two criminals who had just confessed to the world. The day ended not with a bang, but with the quiet scratching of the court reporter's stylus, recording the moment the Larson empire officially crumbled into dust. The final day of the trial did not begin with a gavel strike. It began with a suffocating silence. The air in the courtroom was so heavy it felt like breathing underwater. The gallery was packed to capacity, bodies pressed together on the wooden benches, everyone waiting to see if the Larson dynasty would finally crumble, or if money would once again buy immunity. I sat at the plaintiff's table, my hands resting on the cool wood. I looked at the empty space where the evidence had piled up over the last few days. We had proven the forgery. We had proven the theft. But Naomi Fletcher was not done. She told me that morning that we needed to prove something far more sinister than greed. We needed to prove erasure. We needed to show that for 15 years, my father and stepmother had not just stolen my money, but they had actively conspired to delete my existence from my mother's legacy. Naomi stood up. She wore a suit of sharp, slate gray. She looked like a storm cloud rolling in over the ocean. "The plaintiff calls Margaret Doyle to the stand," Naomi announced. The rear doors opened, and the bailiff assisted Margaret as she made her way down the aisle. She moved slowly, leaning heavily on her cane, but her eyes were sharp behind her glasses. She took the oath, her voice wavering but clear. Naomi approached her gently. "Mrs. Doyle, you were the neighbor of Julia Larson for many years, were you not?" "I was," Margaret said. "We shared a fence line for a decade. I watched Nevaeh grow up in that backyard." "Did you speak to Julia Larson shortly before her death?" 2 days before," Margaret nodded. "She came to the fence. She was holding a jar of preserves, but her hands were shaking. She looked terrified." "What did she tell you, Mrs. Doyle?" Margaret looked directly at Richard, who was staring at the table, refusing to meet her gaze. "She told me that she had hidden something. She said that her husband was making moves to take everything. She made me promise that if I ever saw Nevaeh come back to the house, if I ever saw her touch the fireplace, I was to tell her to find a lawyer named Mercer." "Did she say why she put the documents in the fireplace?" Naomi asked. "She said it was the only place cold enough to keep a secret," Margaret said. "She said Richard never touched the hearth because he hated getting his hands dirty. She knew he would never look there. She told me she was setting a trap, and she prayed her daughter would one day be brave enough to spring it." The jury looked at me. They saw the connection now. My return to Alder Street was not a random act of trespassing. It was the fulfillment of a plan set in motion by a desperate mother 20 years ago. "Thank you, Mrs. Doyle," Naomi said. Margaret stepped down, casting one last look of disdain at Camilla. Naomi walked back to her table and picked up a plastic evidence bag. Inside was the note that had appeared on my doormat on Christmas morning. "Your Honor," Naomi said, turning to the judge, "the defense has tried to argue that this note is a fabrication. They claim my client, or perhaps Mr. Mercer, forged it recently to create a dramatic pretext for this lawsuit. I would like to submit the forensic analysis of this document." She handed a file to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge and the defense team. Mark Duvall scanned it, his brow furrowing. "We had the paper and ink analyzed by the Federal Crime Lab," Naomi told the jury. "The paper is a high-cotton bond that ceased production in 2002. The ink is an iron gall formula that has oxidized consistent with being applied to the paper over a decade ago." A murmur went through the room. "But here's the most important finding," Naomi continued, her voice rising. We found 3 sets of latent fingerprints on this note. 1 set belongs to Nevaeh Larson, 1 set belongs to Evan Mercer, and the 3rd set belongs to Julia Larson. I gasped softly. I had not known this. Naomi had kept this detail from me until this exact moment. Mr. Mercer testified that he traced the words, Naomi said, turning to the jury. That is true, but he did not write it on new paper. He used a blank sheet of Julia's own stationery, taken from the files she gave him for safekeeping. He used her own pen. This note was physically touched by Julia Larson before she died. She prepared the paper. She prepared the words in her drafts. Evan Mercer merely acted as the scribe who finally delivered the message she could not send herself. I looked at the note on the evidence table. It was not just a piece of paper. It was a relic. My mother had held that sheet. She had likely cried over it, wondering if I would ever see it. This proves intent, Naomi declared. This proves that the plan to guide Nevaeh to the fireplace was not a recent invention. It was Julia's final wish. Camilla was shaking her head in the witness box, mumbling something under her breath. And now, Naomi said, moving in for the kill. Let us discuss why that guidance was necessary. Why did Julia feel she had to hide a key in a gift box? Why did she have to bury documents in a chimney? Naomi pulled a small remote from her pocket. We have heard the defense claim that the incident on Christmas Eve 15 years ago was a simple disciplinary matter. They claim they did not know about the key or the note. They claim they were just parents dealing with a spoiled child. She pointed the remote at the audio system. Let us listen to what they said when they thought no one was listening. The speakers crackled to life. It was the recording I had made at Frost Cove just days ago. The sound quality was crystal clear. I still have nightmares about that night. My voice on the recording said, "You hit me. You were so angry." Then, Camilla's voice cut through the courtroom, sharp and shrill. I was not terrified. I was disciplining a rude child. It felt like more than that. My recorded voice pressed, "You burned the note. Camilla, you put the key in your pocket." Because it was a bomb. Camilla's scream filled the room. I told you not to open that box because I knew what poison your mother had put in there. The jury recoiled. The violence in her voice was undeniable. I took that key because I was protecting this family from financial ruin. The recording continued. Yes, I burned the note, and I would do it again, because everything we have exists because we took control. We fixed her mess. Naomi hit the pause button. The silence that followed was deafening. We fixed her mess, Naomi repeated, looking at Camilla. That is an admission of destruction of evidence. That is an admission of theft. Mrs. Larson admits she took the key. She admits she burned the note. She admits she did it to stop Nevaeh from accessing the assets. Richard stood up. His face was purple with rage. He looked like a cornered animal, stripped of his dignity and his defenses. She was entrapped, Richard shouted, pointing a shaking finger at Naomi. That recording was taken without consent. It is a manipulation. It is a confession, Mr. Larson, the judge said calmly. Sit down. I will not sit down, Richard roared, losing the last shred of his composure. He turned to the gallery, his eyes wild. You do not understand. You look at her, he pointed at me, and you see a victim. I see a liability. I built Harborline. Me, Julia just had the name. I did the work. And I was not going to let 20 years of my blood and sweat be flushed down the toilet because Julia wanted to give it all to a girl who has never worked a day in her life. Duval tried to grab Richard's arm, but Richard shook him off. All of this, Richard gestured to the courtroom. The trust, the shell companies. Yes, I did it, and I would do it again, because I had to save the company from her. He pointed at me again, his eyes filled with pure, unadulterated hate. All I did was ensure that Harborline did not fall into the hands of a daughter who does not know how to keep her mouth shut. A daughter who would have ruined us with her questions and her morals. The entire room gasped. The court reporter stopped typing, her hands hovering over the keys. Richard froze. He realized, too late, what he had just said. In his arrogance, In his desperate need to justify his actions, he had just confessed to the motive. He had admitted that he defrauded me not because I was incompetent, but because I had morals. He had admitted that he viewed my inheritance as a threat to his corrupt empire. A daughter who cannot keep her mouth shut, Naomi repeated slowly. She looked at the jury. He just told you exactly why they did it. They did not steal the money because they needed it. They stole it because they knew Nevaeh would not let them launder money for the mob. They stole it because she was honest, and they were not. Naomi walked back to her table and sat down. She did not need a closing argument. Richard Larson had just made it for her. The plaintiff rests, Naomi said quietly. Judge Coleman looked at Richard, who had sunk back into his chair, his face buried in his hands. He looked at Camilla, who was staring blankly at the wall, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. The judge cleared his throat. He adjusted his glasses and looked down at the stack of evidence files on his bench. He picked up the USB drive. He picked up the charred fragments of the fireplace putty that had been entered into evidence. He picked up the Christmas note. "I have heard the testimony," Judge Coleman said, his voice deep and resonant. "I have seen the documents provided by Mr. Mercer. I have heard the admission of guilt from the defendant, Mrs. Larson, on the recording, and I have just witnessed the outburst from Mr. Larson regarding his motivations." He paused, looking directly at me. "This court finds that the document dated August 15th, 2001 is the valid and legal. Last will and testament of Julia Larson. The subsequent will filed by Richard Larson is hereby declared a forgery and is null and void." I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 15 years. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the court orders the immediate restoration of the Juniper Trust, all assets, including the 45% voting stake in Harborline Communities, are to be transferred to the control of Nevaeh Larson effective immediately. The transfers to Blue Heron Development are voided as fraudulent conveyances." He turned his gaze to the defense table. Regarding the actions of Richard and Camilla Larson, the judge's voice turned steel hard. This was not a family dispute. This was a systematic, decade-long conspiracy to defraud a beneficiary, obstruct justice, and launder illicit funds. I am referring this entire case record, including the testimony regarding the involvement of Mr. Leo Harrington, to the United States Attorney's Office for immediate criminal prosecution. The gavel came down. Bang. It was over. Pandemonium erupted in the courtroom. Federal marshals moved toward the defense table. I saw Duvall trying to block them, arguing about bail, but the marshals were not listening. I watched as they asked Richard to stand up and place his hands behind his back. I watched Camilla scream as the metal cuffs clicked around her wrists. I did not feel joy. I did not feel triumph. I felt a profound, quiet peace. I looked down at the table. The note was still there, sitting in its plastic bag. The old fireplace remains. I picked it up. I held it against my chest. "We did it, Mom," I whispered. "You protected me." Naomi put her arm around my shoulders. "It is over. Nevaeh, you own the company. You own the truth." "I do not want the company," I said, watching my father being led away. "I am going to dissolve it. I am going to sell off the assets, pay back the people they hurt, and burn Harborline to the ground, just like they tried to burn me." We walked out of the courtroom. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the noise of the hallway hit us. Reporters were shouting my name. Cameras were flashing. But I did not look down this time. I looked straight ahead. I walked out of the courthouse and onto the wide stone steps. It was late afternoon. The storm had broken. The sun was shining, bright and blinding, reflecting off the snow that covered the city. The ice was melting. Water dripped from the eaves of the courthouse, a steady, rhythmic drumming that sounded like the ticking of a clock that had finally stopped. I took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. For 15 years, I had been the girl who was beaten for opening a gift. I had been the girl who was silenced. I had been the girl freezing on the patio while my family celebrated inside. But as I stood there in the sunlight, clutching the note from my mother, I knew that story was gone. I was no longer the victim of a Christmas tragedy. I was the woman who had walked through the fire and came out holding the key. I walked down the steps, my heels clicking on the wet stone, walking away from the Larson legacy and into a future that was finally, truly mine. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below to share your thoughts and connect with others. Please do not forget to subscribe to the channel Lila Revenge Stories, like the video, and hit the hype button to help this story reach even more people.